Hi everyone, you're about to watch a conversation that I had with Marion and Susan from 4Women Scotland following the news that the Scottish Government will not appeal the court's decision that the UK government was right to put a stop to the Scottish Government's self-ID bill. It's the first time that I've done a meeting like this online and recorded it, and there was a button that I forgot to press, so for the first 15 minutes, 12 to 15 minutes, you can't actually see Marion or Susan. You can hear them, but I've put in a picture of them, and then after about 12 to 15 minutes, you will see them themselves on screen. Sorry about that. And then at the end, the whole conversation kind of gets cut off unceremoniously, just as we're, wishing people a Merry Christmas. So, a few teething issues, but hey, you'll live, you'll learn. Okay, let's go straight to the conversation. Hi everyone, I am very pleased this evening to have with me here Susan and Marion from 4Women Scotland, who have been fighting their asses off for the last 5 years or so to make sure that women's rights and the rights of girls based on that thing called sex are protected in law, and that no dodgy politicians are riding roughshod all over it with their inclusive policies and bills. And I'm so pleased that I'm talking to them right now, because yesterday we had some very, very, very good news. But Marion, how about you tell us?
Well, we are extremely excited because we have just found out that the Scottish Government are not going to be appealing the ruling on the Section 35. So in short, goodbye self-ID, goodbye GRR reform. So for the past 5 years that ourselves and the wider public have been campaigning on this, it kind of shows that our views were valid. And the law actually agrees with us. It did have an impact on the Equality Act. It does have an impact on women and children and gays and everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so this afternoon, 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗀 made a statement about how they are not going to appeal it. So it just hangs in the ether. So goodbye self-ID. Yeah. Don't let you hit it on your backside on the way out, GRR.
So self-ID dead in the water. Susan, how did you feel when you heard the news?
Oh gosh, it's been so long, and you keep thinking things are going to go horribly wrong at the last minute. And obviously last Christmas we were right up to the limit on sitting through those dreadful long night sessions, and it was agonizing. The whole thing was agonizing. So it's actually really nice. This is a year. It's been a full year. We've just got a completely different vibe this Christmas. So heading into a much more jolly festive season. So I think, yeah, ho, ho, ho.
Ho, 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 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗀. So the first time that we met was actually in September, the first week of September 2021 in Edinburgh, when you had organized a rally outside Holyrood, outside the Scottish Parliament, to oppose self-ID. Tell me a bit about what that day was like for you, and what made you, how that day came about.
Well, we'd done one before lockdown outside Parliament, and that was when the consultation was just about to close. And then we got a new Parliament, and it was the opening of Parliament, First Minister's questions, and we just wanted to send a really strong message. We knew that this was going to be the parliamentary year for looking at self-ID and doing the committee and the consultation and responses and more calls for evidence and all of this stuff. So we just wanted to send a really clear message that there are so many people standing here who are really, really angry and oppose this. And it was a really incredible day. There were so many people. It was and it was marked by a number of the most bizarre things, including the person shouting "witch,
witch, witch, witch." But see, there was something about that moment that was that showed how out of touch, I guess, this man was, but also the people who support all this stuff, because somebody had just done a speech about the last witch that was burned in Scotland.
Yes.
And then you get someone shouting "witch, witch, witch," right there and then, like none of it ever mattered. And
yeah.
I mean, obviously, I come at this from a gay man's perspective. What's it like for you, first of all, to be women that say, "Hey, women need protecting in law." There's this whole history. There's all these battles that have been fought, and now you're up against a group of people who just want to undo all of that.
Quite depressing, I think, isn't it, Marion? And especially, heading into that period and having to go into Parliament and sit at committee with people who are really, really hostile, and including the First Minister, who was busy saying, "I'm a feminist to my fingertips." In fact, I think somebody at that rally had a sign saying "feminist to my fingertips." And she was making out that she was all for women, but she demonized us. She said the most horrific things about women who are opposed to self-ID. And then you had to go into Parliament and sit in front of a committee, including people like Maggie Chapman, or I had to sit in front of them, who were actively hostile. You could feel these waves of anger and disgust coming off them. And I think, it's not surprising many people have been intimidated out of speaking up. Don't know what you think.
Yeah, just to follow up on for what Susan was saying, it's looking back to that event, which was awesome, and it was such good fun, and you could see the difference between the likes of ourselves who were fighting for our rights. It was like, here's a general public, here's those who are voting, and here's a group of individuals that, quite frankly, including the individual that was shouting "witch, witch, witch," clearly needed some support in real life. But it's not going to be, and it's about self-ID. These are individuals that need mental health support. It's not about kind of what self-ID would ever help them in this. And actually understanding that Parliament can't understand what that group was really wanting, and why we had concerns about said individual shouting "witch, witch, witch," that wants self-ID to meander into our spaces. So those who were actually at that, it was so clear, and I could see the police kind of, and those in the community police, who were excellent on the day, but you could see them kind of looking between the two groups, one who was actually speaking sense and weren't actually trying to be harmful or take away rights from another group, and this other group that were really intimidating and were doing their best to kind of shut down our protest. Didn't work. And and then to go into Parliament, as Susan was saying, and meet these MSPs that were extremely hostile, but then you realize that they've been listening to this other group and never even bothered opening their ears to us or to what our concerns were. They may say they listened, they didn't hear. We were probably just like kind of the high-pitched sound, that floats around.
The shrill voices.
The shrill voices. Our voices aren't deep enough. They're not manly enough to actually clearly be heard by parliamentarians. So it's been a fascinating experience over the past few years to actually realise that we fought so hard for women's rights in this country, and realise how precarious they actually are.
Mm-hmm. One thing that struck me on the day is, for me, that was the first sort of rally or protest that I attended, actually outside a Parliament building somewhere. And as I walked past to get to the front, I thought, well, this is where it happens. This is where the decisions are being made. And there was a really good turnout on the day. There was a big group of people, and there were plenty of women. There were also men. The signs were fantastic. I always really love the creativity of the signs. There's one particular woman, I don't know her real name, but she goes on Twitter by Mr. Ben, who always produces the most wonderful signs. And then there was a much smaller group on the other side waving the trans flag and the rainbow flag. And I thought, the rainbow flag used to represent me. And now you represent everything that I'm against. And it felt so surreal and alienating. And I can imagine from your point of view, when you even, like the speeches on the day they were really powerful, and they were beautiful, and they were poignant. And the one that sticks out in my mind was Susan 𝗿𝗂𝗽𝗀𝗃, who, I can't remember how she said it, but it was quite poetic. It was something about the echoes of our sisters' voices, or something along those lines, you know. And she brought it into perspective with the whole history of fighting for women's rights. So, and then you stand outside that place, and as you say, you know that the people in there are actively hostile against you. And when they say, oh, we're listening, you know, if they do it, it's just for a tick box exercise, but they're not actually listening. So what is it with the likes of Nicola Sturgeon, you know, who absolutely knows what a man and a woman is, that she's gone along with it to the degree that she has?
Oh, it's really difficult. I mean, I think there are some people who are true believers. I will put someone like Maggie Chapman in that category. And by the way, your point about the flag, I remember her standing up in one of those debates and talking about us and saying that we were wearing borrowed colours. In other words, that we had stolen the suffragette colours. And she's standing there in a rainbow lanyard. And my understanding is that Maggie Chapman is a straight woman. So I thought, how dare you? How dare you say that with a straight face? But I actually think...
With a straight face. But
I think some of them are so far gone down that pathway of genuinely, it is almost like a religious belief. And I find that quite disturbing in a legislator. I'd be quite frightened if there were any religious extremists in Parliament. Well, there may be, I don't know, but I find that quite frightening. But I don't know about Sturgeon. I think she had decided she was going to do this, and I think she is somebody who does not like to be proven wrong, and so she will stick and dig into something, even if a more thoughtful or intellectual politician would go, you know what, I messed up. I need to step back. I need to reconsider, because there's no weakness in admitting you're wrong. But I think she is the kind of person who thinks there is. And to my mind, that means that she is not as clever or as strong as she probably thinks she is, because it would have taken a better, more intelligent, stronger person than she is to admit that she made a mistake.
Well, I'm a bit more, I think it's quite simply down to the fact that she thought it was an age thing, and it was actually going to bring her more votes in. She thought it was, part of it certainly was to do with, she thought this was a new youth movement, and thought that this could possibly bring her some extra votes in. I mean, she did the 𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗃 from the cupboard. I don't know if anyone's actually watched it, where she was calling back for some of the young, predominantly male members of the SNP who had a bit of a fit and said, that's it, I'm leaving, you know, the SNP. So she did this taped video message to these young individuals from a cupboard, which it looked like, basically promising them all things under the sun.
Well,
so
some people do say that she's in the closet in a certain way.
Never comment on that. But yeah, but it does seem to, I think someone told her somewhere that this was another aspect of getting some votes in. I mean, she in Scotland, we have the votes for the MSPs are 16 years old, so the SNP pushed that forward. And I think this was another one thinking this could be another youth movement to get votes. So, and she never really thought of the consequences. So it was all about the votes.
I think that, yeah, that's very true. I think when you look at Alex Salmond obviously had a huge following within the SNP, and the sort of old school SNP had been very much his group. And when she came in, she was very much his protege, and she didn't really have her own constituency. So I think it's a good point that these were the younger people who'd probably come in during the independence campaign. And a lot of them really took over on some of the floor level, the ground floor level of operations in the SNP, and a lot of them were getting themselves elected to officers or local posts. So there has been quite a big split. I think that's why you saw that split reflected in the vote. It was an incredible thing, really, because the SNP always had extraordinary discipline. It's been a very broad church because the one thing they believe in is independence. And beyond that, there was difference. And I think that's why they always tried to follow quite a centrist line, because they didn't want to upset the horses too much. And this really exposed some of those divisions within the different wings of that party.
Yet the young youth lot that were campaigning on this all seem to have disappeared. Because that's kind of happens. You grow up. I mean, we can all actually can understand that we may have been caught up with something, no matter what it could have been, as youth. But weirdly enough, when mortgages and bills and everything else start hitting the ground, you actually kind of realise that luxury beliefs are not something you can spend so much time on.
Earlier, you were saying how the MSPs weren't very welcoming, to say the least. What about, particularly from the SNP, but what about MSPs from some of the other parties, from, say, Labour or the Conservatives?
Well, the first MSP who really stood up was 𝗍𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗀, and she is SNP. So, and she lost her seat partly due to shenanigans, we think, related to this. And she really did make a stand. And then there were others within the SNP who then rebelled. And then following on from her, we had some quite remarkable Labour women like Joanne Lamont, Jenny Mara and Elaine Smith, who really fought through, especially on hate crime and on the Forensic Medical Services Bill. And then they all went, sadly. All of that lot went at the 2021 election.
Okay.
So we lost those really strong voices. There were some great women, though, in the Conservatives, and some of those came in at the last election. And so MSPs like Rachel Hamilton, Tess White, and Pam Gosal, who was on the committee with Rachel, they really took it on and ran with it. I think Labour made a mistake because they whipped their MSPs to vote for GRR.
Right.
And there were quite a few of those MSPs who really did not buy into it. And obviously 2 of them were brave enough to openly rebel. And obviously that took great courage as well. But I think Labour have been lukewarm on it. I think Labour had a couple of people who were really hardline TRAs. And instead of saying, we'll give you a free vote, they thought we can't convert them, so we'll just whip it this way. And it was foolish. It was a disaster because many of them...
This is really interesting because, like, earlier I was watching that news report from, is it called 9, that show? You posted it on Twitter where they interviewed Shona Robertson, and she's like, well, you know, Parliament voted for it, but actually a good portion were whipped to vote for it.
Yeah, they also kind of they constantly say that that this was undemocratic, and yeah, well, what kind of Westminster was using Section 35, so they had to change their language and actually say it was democratic because the parliamentarians voted for it. I'm going, it wasn't democratic because the general public, Scottish public, didn't want it. And I'm going, what is this? What are you trying to say? That you actually think it's democratic that members of parliament who don't have the support of the Scottish public are voting for something? And going, can you not see that that doesn't make any sense? That's not democracy. But no one wanted it. You wanted it, and parties forced it through.
Trans women are women, and undemocratic shenanigans is democratic. Like,
yes,
everything's the opposite.
Yes. Yeah. And it would, you know, I think there's precedent, isn't there, on things like equal marriage. Votes like that have often been free votes because they're considered conscience votes. And so it's not like a budget where you kind of have to whip your MSPs.
Yeah.
It was something that it was hugely divisive with it. So the only party in the Scottish Parliament that allowed a free vote were the Conservatives.
Wow.
And some of their members, was it 3 of their members voted for it? So, you know, they allowed them to do that.
So this time last year, the Scottish Parliament had voted for self-ID. What did that feel like at the time? Were you like, oh, all this hard work has been for nothing? Or is it not as black and white as that?
That was really frustrating. It was awful. It was horrible. Marion had a shout at them at one point.
I did, and I'm normally really good, despite what people think. I'm normally, quite reserved. But listening to, I think what got me, there had been a motion put forward by the Conservatives to ensure that those that have been convicted of rape, sexual assault against, women, shouldn't be allowed to be able to change your name in self-ID. There was various different amendments then put down. And so we were hearing all these amendments coming through, and then they do a vote. And then I could not believe that something so straightforward as this is a safeguarding measure, and it still didn't get through. And at that point, I just thought, what are we doing here? Have these people lost their minds? I mean, this is something just so straightforward, and it really wouldn't help about the self-ID, but at least would have put some aspect of protection in. And I've been sitting on my hands, and then I just
oh, you were there. You were there in Parliament.
Yeah. And so up in the gods.
Actually, that motion, it was a joint motion. So it was one of the Conservatives, but it was also Michelle Thompson, who's that amendment, sorry, not that motion, who's SNP. And she has spoken very movingly about her own rape. So the fact that one of their own put in this motion saying, as somebody who's experienced this, please do not open the doorway to the possibility of rapists being able to change their name and their gender. And they went, nah, it'll be fine. And it was horrifying. It
never happens, right?
Yeah, until it did.
And then, yes, I mean, you've been working your ass so far, but also then wasn't there a moment where there was this bloke called Beth who was also up in the gallery or whatever, and then some people looked at him and his posse and applauded and like, this is for you or something like that?
Yeah, that was at the very end. That was when the bill kind of passed, and they said, now the bill is passed, and the politicians, predominantly the SNP and some Labour, turned to the gallery and started clapping, for about 6 or 7 trans rights activists that were sitting in the gallery, all of whom have been absolutely shown in the past and currently to be horrendous towards women online and in person. And so they turned around and were actually clapping them. So the trans actors stood up and were clapping them. And then you saw these politicians turn around and clapping them. Luckily for me, I wasn't in the gallery at that point because I'd stormed off.
Yeah.
So I had to watch that. Luckily, not in person, because I think that might have just finished me off. And I watched it. I saw that on the large screen downstairs in Parliament, and they were just clapping them. I mean, it was just shocking to actually view. And one of them was, yes, correct, is Big Beth. And there was another rally after this point of where Alex Cole Hamilton, who's MSP for the Liberal Democrats, turned around and said, "We did it for you, Beth."
Right. And all of this must just feel like an absolute kick in the teeth and a real betrayal, I guess.
Well, it just showed that for some of them, we do it for Beth, do it for Amber, they'll do things for the men.
With dicks.
There are some politicians in there who will do whatever men want. And that was the take home. They won't even listen to victims of rape, but they will do whatever these men want. And there have been various allegations, which I will not say, about some of those men in that gallery, and which makes it even more horrific that they would do that.
But then, as depressing as that might have been, only a few weeks later, everything changed. Because of a bloke showing his meat and veg in a pair of purpley leggings. Tell me about that.
So the lovely 𝗿𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀, I think we're referring to, is a bit of a case study in why it's dangerous, for sex offenders to be allowed to change their name. I mean, he wasn't a sex offender, obviously, at the time. He hadn't been convicted. But this was someone who was born Adam Bryson. He got married.
Adam Graham, right?
No, Adam Graham.
He was born Adam Bryson.
Ah.
Then he got married, and his wife's name was Graham, and he took his wife's name.
Okay.
And then he reverted to Bryson and changed his first name. I can't remember now what he changed it to. It was a female name. And his wife was trying to find him to press charges against him and B, divorce him. But he was changing his name. He changed his gender identity. Then he changed his name again to 𝗿𝗲𝗀𝗀. In the interim, he'd enrolled on this beauty course at a college. It's at this college full of teenage girls, and was helping them with their spray tans, which it doesn't bear thinking about. And then the police caught up with him. Well, no, the police must have caught up with him before he became 𝗿𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀, didn't they? Because he was charged as Adam for these 2 rapes. And so it was after he was charged that he changed his name and gone to the college. And then
he's a big bloke, right? He's a big mean-looking bloke with a tattoo on his face. It's not like he's one of these so-called pretty boys, that everybody wants to be kind to, and just let them pass because girly, girly, girly.
No, he's a scary looking guy, and he'd already been charged with rape, and he's there at the college with these teenage girls, and they didn't know, obviously. And so this is I mean, it was such a perfect case study of why self-ID is dangerous, because this individual was able to use his gender identity to encroach on women's services, even with this charge hanging over him. And then, of course, he's convicted. And the first thing that happened after his conviction was somebody at the Scottish government picked up the phone and said, no, don't take him to a male prison. He's a delicate lady person. Take him to court and fail.
He's done a beauty degree.
One bit that public are not really aware of, albeit it was slightly reported in the press, that when he was at college, he joined the �LGBT_QI++++, group for college, and he bullied. This is a straight guy as well, so straight guy. So he joins the LGBTQI and started bullying all the lesbian, gays, and bis within the group. So they all left. So this guy was a holy horror on everything. So I mean, he just couldn't help himself. So yeah, so he joined the LGBTQI community as a straight guy.
Right.
So
and
he was the most marginalized.
And I'm supposed to stand with her in the, you know, under the guise of, oh, support your community, rather than with two women like yourselves, and then I get called a pick-me gay. So they'd rather that I stand with a male double rapist that I will affirm as a woman, and whose victims I will have believed that they were raped by a woman, than to stand with two women like yourselves who actually support the gays.
Yep.
Yep, that's about it.
Pretty much summed it up nicely.
So, I mean, you've been in this, what, 5 years now? And
the rest, 5 years is for Women Scotland. Well, 5.5 years, but I mean,
right.
We've been campaigning before this, but for Women Scotland's been 5.5 years in the making.
You know how heavy this is. You know, we can have a laugh, we can have a, you know, a light-hearted chat about some of the aspects, but it is heavy, and it's depressing, and it's hurtful. How do you deal with that? Do you sort of take quite a practical approach and just go, look, we just got to get on with this. This is where we are at. This is what's happening. This is what we can do. But do you also have moments where you just go,
I have a lot of those. I have a lot of those.
A combination of both. I mean, we are quite practical. We don't get distracted. We are quite focused as an organisation. You just have to keep going, because what else can you do? You just have to keep going. But what keeps us going is kind of the friendships and the laughs and the camaraderie that we've made, whether it's just the directors of Women Scotland. Trina's not on the call, but we also, and she lives up in Wick. But the three of us have well bonded over the years, so we keep each other going through thick and thin. And also the support from the other women and men throughout the wider UK and the world. And it's been quite good fun. So it's not all about, it's not all about kind of a doom and gloom.
Okay. And the other thing that that I guess you've seen grow is the public support. And especially the women, and obviously men as well, coming to these rallies, these meetings, and I'm sure that must bolster you as well to keep going.
Definitely, I think Lucy mentioned it the other day as well, when Lucy Hunter-Blackburn, when she was giving evidence at committee, that you have this whole body of women sitting behind you all the time if you go into committee, and having people sitting there behind you knowing they're supporting you, it makes such a huge difference. I think there was one committee session I gave evidence way back in 2019 where I was on my own and I felt really vulnerable. So it really helps when you've got that massive, you've got that support, and we had that in court as well. It makes all the difference.
Right. And women won't wish becoming a thing. I mean, that's not being used by English people and Welsh people, right?
And Americans.
Yeah.
Went around the world.
And how do you feel about all this work that you've put in over these years, and all these meetings you've gone to, and all these boring, you know, committees and whatever else, and then you don't get to where you want, and then a male rapist shows up and everything changes?
You don't want that to happen. You know, we don't want to be proved right, in the sense that we don't want people to get hurt. But it was inevitable, and that was that, and it would only get worse under self-ID.
And isn't that the sad thing about it?
Yeah.
that it was inevitable.
Yeah, the scary thing is as well, though, that the general public are not aware that in Scotland, albeit that 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗃 was moved back to the male estate, we have 9 males currently in the female estate now in Scotland. Wow. Because their crimes weren't crimes against women and or children, so they're still there. So this is shocking. So we're still kind of working and fighting on that one. These men should not be in the female estate.
They're murderers. They're not.
So just because they didn't murder a female, they murdered other men.
But how do we know? How do we know they didn't? Did anyone ask the victim? But that's the absurdity you get to. That they say, oh, well, if they've murdered a woman, but they don't know what a woman is, and they could be women. And they're in the female estate, and the new prison guidance is awful. So there are more men still in Scottish women's prison facilities than there are in the whole of the rest of the UK. And of course, Scotland is 1/10 of the population.
Right.
I think there's about double the number. There are less than 5 in the rest of the UK. I think that's right, isn't it? And we've got 9. So and then the new prison policy came in, and what they said was that as a first point of principle, somebody who has committed violence, but only violence against women, so again, same thing, they could have murdered a man, they shouldn't be placed in the female estate in the first instance. But if there's a risk assessment and the risk assessment determines that they are no longer a risk, now how the hell do you do that? But they could then be moved into the women's estate. So someone like 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗃 Bryson or Andrew Miller, who was the butcher who
I know
the 11-year-old girl, if in the future somebody within the prison estate decides that they're terribly sorry and they're being very nice and sweet and helping in the kitchen or whatever, they could be moved back into the women's estate, and that's just beyond horrific.
And
the reason
go on.
Sorry, and the reason why we got to this point is because organisations like Scottish Prison Service and others believe that, and we're told by lobbying groups like Equality Network, Stonewall, etc., that we were going to be moving to self-ID. So they got ahead of the law. So they were all told, they said, oh, you want to get ahead of the law, self-ID is coming in. So all these policies, including SPS, were all done on the back of there was going to be self-ID. So now that, albeit that today is a very celebratory day, we've got a heck of a lot of work in Scotland to actually start moving through all the organisations, including the NHS, and education and all manner of different public boards type thing, to actually bring it back to actually what the law states. So there's so much work, and this is going to cost quite a lot of money to these organisations, and I hope they actually know who to blame for or they should blame themselves for being idiots for actually listening to lobbying groups who are telling you to go ahead of the law.
And this was the problem in the debate, in the GRR debate, that all these politicians were going, oh, well, it won't actually change anything because people use these facilities anyway. And they didn't stop and say, but should they be? And one of the things that came through when we took the Scottish Government to court to try and establish exactly what a GRC really does mean, was that the Scottish Government lawyers are standing there saying, yes, well, people who are male, who are legally male and biologically male, obviously they are not entitled to use these spaces and services. Oh, that's interesting. So you do know that that's what the law says, but the MSPs are standing there in Parliament saying, no, of course you self-ID onto hospital wards or you self-ID into changing rooms. And they admitted that wasn't the legal position.
No, and I mean, one thing, Marion, that you mentioned about the Scottish Prison Service, Scottish Prison Service, is there was something I read a while ago. There was a woman who used to run the Scottish Trans Alliance, or be high up in it, called James or something. And she actually was instrumental in getting guidance in place for the Scottish Prison Service to allow males into female jails. And she even wrote about it in a book, where she wrote something along the lines of, and I just can't believe how twisted this is. If we can convince, I'm paraphrasing, if we can convince people to let males into female prisons, where you get some of the most vulnerable women in all of society, then we'll be able to convince them to allow men into women's spaces anywhere, like it was just a test case. And fuck the women, right? Fuck these women. And this woman, James, herself is a woman as much as she claims to be a man. How on earth do they think that's okay? And how have they got people to push it through as policy? Because it's one thing saying to an institution, you need to anticipate that this will become law, so you will need to be ahead of the law. But at the same time, they're then going to government and politicians going, oh, well, look at what these places are doing now. Now as the law, you're behind, you need to catch up with them. It's dirty, the way that
yeah, that's Scottish politics for you. Unfortunately, compared to England and Wales, we rely very much on the third sector. So where services used to be provided as part of, the council or various different other aspects, now they've moved a lot of services to third sector groups. So you have the likes of LGBT Scotland, for example, which is predominantly kind of a lobbying group, but they also now offer kind of counselling based services that will be referred to by clinicians here, whether it be CAMS or something like that. Now, these individuals are not actually specialists. They're talking about peer-to-peer type aspects. So when you realise how things work here in Scotland, you realise how lobbyists and like Scottish Trans Alliance, who don't actually provide any frontline services at all, they're purely a lobbying group. They're a project group of Equality Network, who are only a lobbying group, again not providing any frontline services, but they're wholly and solely supported by Scottish government. Right. And so you've got this horrible twisted circle of where they get absolutely funded by them. So they tell what they want the politicians to do, and they go, oh well, we won't be led astray by these organisations, and then it's the end of this horrible circle about kind of, I'll tell you what to do, you pay me, and then no one actually says they're wrong until we come along who are not getting paid, and actually go, this is ridiculous,
and it's the Scottish government, is signed up to the Stonewall scheme. And obviously Stonewall's not as big in Scotland as it is in the rest of the UK because we've got Equality Network. But we still have the Stonewall scheme and they're signed up for it. So they're coming in, training civil servants about what to think and what the law is. And then they bring this in and they think, oh, well, we have to do that because Stonewall's told us to. And Stonewall is lobbying the politicians, or Equality Network is lobbying the politicians to do that too. So the civil servants weren't looking properly at this either, because Marion had an interesting meeting way back when with civil servants, and they really hadn't. It was all about, but this is the next thing in human rights. Right, we have to do it. And so nobody's been doing their blinking job. And what we've seen with FOIs and things like that are people in government, civil servants, they get a question from uppity women like us and they get on the blower or send an email to Equality Network and say, oh, we've been asked about this, what should we say? You shouldn't be asking them what the government should be telling with us.
It's like they want to be handheld and then they want to get a gold star for it if they do the thing that the lobbyists tell them to do. I mean, if you had your own scheme, you know, your not the diversity scheme, but the women, you know, power to the women scheme, I don't know, and where you dish out, you know, gold stars, but also misogynist awards or something. We should
Maybe
all
we should start doing that.
𝗿𝗲𝗀𝗃𝗃 would win the misogynist award, I think. Every year.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and there's so much more to talk about. But obviously, so self-ID now dead in the water. Also, we've had 𝗀𝗃𝗽𝗀𝗃 in Parliament clearly stating at the dispatch box, Stonewall doesn't, you know, decide what the law is. And there, in the Netherlands, self-ID has now been kicked in the long grass for now. And we're also seeing that in terms of healthcare, there have been multiple systemic evidence reviews that have shown that for things like puberty blockers, there actually isn't any good quality evidence to justify them being given to sex-distressed youth. So with all these things together, do you feel that people will now start listening to For Women Scotland more? Because it's not just one thing, it's multiple things happening all at the same time and strengthening your case.
It does. I think within the next year, the general public have certainly heard a lot about this in the news. I mean, even today, you know, with the pulling back of gender self-ID, and that's been all over the news. So before they never heard about this, but now they can't avoid it, and they're actually seeing it in their own education. They're seeing it in their work. You know, that now instead of it going, "What is that?" and just kind of raising a bit of an eyebrow, they're going, "I know what that is. That's about." So they seem to have woken up. So in Scotland, we've got various other bills coming through over the next year or so, and I don't think these are going to get very much an easy passage because the public has woken up. And so there will be hard questions, and the press has actually kind of woken up too. That was a long time to get, I mean, print press and the kind of media as BBC or STV to actually start reporting on this. But now they are. So the more it's reported on, the more it will hopefully quickly just derail. Because as soon as you know about what this actually truly means to youth, to gays, to women, that you actually spot how horrendous this was. And I think there'll be a lot of individuals, some maybe not Patrick Harvey, but that'll be quickly distancing themselves that they had ever done anything to do with this.
The other thing is, obviously there is a big trans lobby, and they're being funded. So now that they've lost this, I'm sure they'll try to bring it back some other way, some other time. And obviously they'll now be focusing even more on things like conversion therapy. I think that's out for consultation in January in Scotland, isn't it? A bill for that. And any other things, because they're not just going to go, okay, never mind, you know, cup of coffee, anyone. They'll be regrouping and strategizing about how can they push all this trans stuff through by any means possible. I mean, you know that they will sink as low as they can, you know, to even go like that James woman did, go for prisons, women in prison first. If we can convince people to do that, we can get away with it anywhere. It's going to be another busy 2024, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And I mean, you know, they've already, there was a big article in the press yesterday about the poor trans youth who so devastated by not getting a GRC. But actually what they were saying was nonsense. These kids they were interviewing, it was things like, but I'm non-binary and that's not going to be recognized, when it was never going to be recognized. Or, well, I can't get a GRC, so how am I going to, I might be attacked by my family. It was complete nonsense, as though this magic piece of paper was going to make everything right. And I think that's what they've been told by the lobbyists. And I do think that in time to come, we're going to have to look at what these kids were told. And I think some of it's quite wicked. You know, there are genuinely people out there who think that women like me and Marion want them dead and are going to attack them and are delighted if anything bad happens to them. And of course, that's not true at all. But they have genuinely been told that, and that's how this is sustained.
This is one of the really sad things about it. I think with these young people that are actually struggling with real issues, then they're not reaching out for these, you know, trends or non-binary identities just for the fun of it. You know, they're looking for something. The way I look at it is they're looking for some kind of freedom that they somehow feel they can't afford themselves by just being themselves. And it matters to them. But it's not, people don't look at like, what really underpins that? They just go along with what's on the surface and the superficial stuff. And I'm sure that if I was a 13-year-old today, I'd be knocking on the, you know, if I was in Scotland, on the Sandyford clinic doors and saying, give me those blockers. If I was a 20-year-old today, I would be a non-binary, demi-ace, romantic, whatever. But I mean, we know now, we're a bit older, we've got more life experience, you put things in perspective. And then you've got people like Maggie Chapman with her straight face in Parliament, with her, you know, rainbow lanyard. She can walk away from all this unscathed. Yes. But those youngsters can't.
Yeah.
And that I find absolutely tragic.
Yeah.
Yeah, going back to what you were saying about James Morton from Scottish Trans Alliance, and yeah, James was held up as being kind of, you know, being very reasonable and was always put forward in the press about how kind of James was. But James did a very telling interview several years ago in the press about how, and I'm saying things that are already in the press, it's in the public domain, about how James was an inpatient in a hospital here in Edinburgh, primary care. And James actually spotted a leaflet that actually, well, she wasn't James at that point. Okay. She was whatever her original name was. And so a leaflet within the hospital grounds for Stonewall Youth Project Scotland. And that's how James ended up on this pathway. So even individuals like James, who have been leading quite problematic pieces of policy and legislation, James herself was actually recruited while an inpatient. And that's when you actually realise how the depths of this movement and how low that they go to recruit in.
Yeah. What it tells me is, on the one hand, it feels like you're up against this huge thing, but on the other hand, it's like there's a few key individuals that seem to be pushing things and being instrumental, which kind of gives me hope, because it also means that a couple of individuals on our side, like yourselves, can also create this difference and bring about huge change. So I want to thank you for both, for putting so much on the line to do that, because you could have easily gone, let somebody else do it. But
this is true. We actually genuinely did. We actually thought within conversations that someone else has been a step forward. And then we realized
that's the same as Bev and Kate from the LGBT Alliance. They're like, oh, let's talk about somebody needs to do something.
Do it. Someone clever enough.
Clever, some politician, someone's going to do it. And then we realized it was us. And then we had this really naive conversation back in the day that we actually thought we'd just give it a year and we'd resolve it.
We've got 1 minute left. How do you think Magdalene Burns would look at this if she was around?
Magdalene would have loved the past couple of years. She'd have been fighting. She'd be kind of standing on. She was probably on top of Hollywood. Let's face it. I mean, she wasn't someone that was going to be hiding in the background. I'd have to get down off Parliament. That's it. That's what she'd be doing. So she'd have and I'm sure that she's looking down on all of us and wishing us a Merry Christmas. And I do have our cat who's kicking around here somewhere.
Oh, so, the cat.
Yeah, you may have heard a meow in the background. Yeah. So she's living vicariously through her cat.
And so
yeah, I think lots of video opportunities, wouldn't there have been?
Oh, yeah.
My goodness.
Right.
But I think,
go on. We've got less than a
obviously.
minute, so I don't know how much time we've got left. I want to wish you a happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas.
And that's where we got cut off, just as we were all about to wish everyone a very, very Merry Christmas. I want to thank Marion and Susan for joining me and wishing you all a Merry, Merry Christmas and see you in the new year. I still have a little Christmas treat up my sleeve, so that will probably follow this weekend. Okay, ciao! Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video useful or informative and you'd like to support me in making more, please consider supporting me via Patreon, or if you prefer, send me some love via PayPal. And thank you so much to those of you who already support me that way. It makes a huge difference. Massive big thank you to my big spenders, 𝗿𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗽, Mama Turf and the Turventeens, the lovely Mary, me Julie, Julia, Dusty, Doodles, Leffy, Dorothy, Wildfire, and Esther. Thank you.